Shabbat Shalom. So rumor has it there's a little football game coming up tomorrow. And what you may not know is that the Torah actually tells us exactly who's going to win. Now, there are some people who may have been raised in Philadelphia, for example, who might turn, he's Canadian, don't let him fool you. There are some people who might turn to the Torah and say very clearly that God is going to carry the Israelites out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, al kanfei nisharim, on the wings of eagles. So perhaps you may look to the Torah and say, aha, clearly the eagles are going to win tomorrow. But the truth is, if you really know your Torah, you'll know that God has a history of sending wicked and strong plagues against God's enemies. And we know one of the most significant plagues that God sends against God's enemies is the plague of hail. Now, does anyone know how to say hail in Hebrew? You remember from, right, dipping the wine, dam, tzvardeya, kinim, right? How do you say hail in Hebrew? Barad. Barad, right? Bet resh dalet. Now, if you really know your Hebrew grammar, you know that if God were talking about my hail that God would send forth against God's enemies, you would add a chirik yud to make it first person possessive. Thus, it would be baradi. So sure enough, if you say it quickly enough, what does God use as a weapon against God's enemies? Baradi. So while you might think that because God carried us out on the wings of eagles, the eagles would win, the truth is God uses his weapons against the enemies of God's people. And thus he will use my classmate from the University of Michigan, Tom Baradi, tomorrow. And that's all I have to say about that. Shabbat Shalom. This week we read from Parashat Yitro, and Max taught us beautifully about the Ten Commandments. And really this is the Torah portion par excellence as we read about Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, the 10 Commandments. But interestingly enough, that's not the name of the Torah portion. It's not the name of the Torah portion. Wouldn't you think the portion that contains the 10 Commandments would be called the portion of the 10 Commandments? But it's not. It's called Parashat Yitro, the Torah portion of Jethro. Not the one that starts, come listen to the story about a man named Jed, a poor mountaineer, barely kept his family fed. Different Jethro, though his name comes from here, Yitro. Yitro was Moses' father-in-law. And indeed, this really begins, before we get to the 10 Commandments, this really begins as the Torah portion of in-laws. Now, of course, there is the old joke, as former President Steve Margolin would tell us. Steve, what is the difference between in-laws and outlaws? Outlaws are wanted. That's correct. He and I didn't even plan it. I knew I could count on him. There is also the story of the man who had been dating for a while, fell in love with the woman, wanted to get married to her, proposed, got engaged, but his mother still had not had the opportunity to meet his fiancée. So sure enough, he invites his mother over for a visit, and he says, Mom, I'm going to put you to the test. I've invited 3 women over to the house. You have to pick which one is my fiancée. And sure enough, the mother's there with her son, and the 3 women walk in the door, and the mother points to one woman and says, aha, that's your fiancée. The man says, oh my gosh, Mom, you're amazing. How in the world did you know that that woman is my fiancée? She said, very easy, that's the woman I hated from the moment she walked in the room. So we have here the Torah portion of in-laws. And I would ask you, what is the best advice you might give on achieving a good parent-in-law, child-in-law relationship? Anyone have any ideas? What is the best advice you'd give to someone on having a good relationship with your in-laws, whether that be your parents-in-law or children-in-law? Well, this is perhaps telltale. Nobody has any good advice. Linda, yes. Don't give any advice unless you're asked. I'm sure that's practiced by everybody here. Very good. Anyone else? Yes, doctor. Tolerance. Tolerance. All right, we got 2 out of several hundred. Very good. Thank you for demonstrating my point. I actually came across a study as I was preparing for the sermon this morning that said in 2008, a Japanese study actually revealed that women who live in a multi-generational house, so what does that mean? That means, let's say, a wife, a mother, who's living in the same house as her husband's parents, her in-laws, and her children, is actually 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from cardiac disease than a woman who doesn't live with her in-laws. Interestingly enough, the husband's rate of cardiac disease is unchanged. Here's an interesting study for you. All right, so if you'll turn with me to your Torah portion, to our Torah portion this week, Parashat Yitro, I'm on page 432. Page 432 in your Eitz Chaim Chumashim. We are in the midst of the book of Exodus, chapter 18. Page 432. And here it says that Jethro, the priest of Midian, remember Jethro was a non-Israelite. Moses married the daughter of a priest of the Midianite people. And here it says, Jethro, priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out from Egypt. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she'd been sent home, and her 2 sons, of whom one was named Gershom, that is to say, I've been a stranger in a foreign land, and the other was named Eliezer, meaning the God of my father was my help. God delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' sons and wife to him in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. Now, what's fascinating so far? What's totally interesting is here's Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, the man who led us out of Egypt and began the journey toward freedom and toward the promised land, did all of that without his wife and kids next to him. They were not part of the Exodus. Remember, Zipporah was a Midianite princess. She lived outside the land of Egypt. Moses' kids with Zipporah would not have been part of the Egyptian slavery experience. And so when Moses went into Egypt and brought our ancestors out and crossed the Red Sea on dry land, his wife and kids were not part of that experience. But now, a month or so later, when they are camping at the foot of Mount Sinai, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, gets word of all that God had done to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. And so Jethro decides it's time for Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, Moses' wife, and Moses and Zipporah's 2 kids, Gershom and Eliezer, to go meet up with Moses and with the Israelites. And so it is, and now I'm on page 433, verse 6. Jethro sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. I like that, her 2 sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed low and kissed him. Each asked after the other's welfare, and they went into the tent. Now, certainly this is descriptive that Moses and his father-in-law must have had a pretty good relationship. Right? Jethro decides it's time for the family to be reunited, and Jethro is the one who makes that reunion happen. And they're excited to see each other. They sit down, they have a cup of coffee, perhaps share a scotch together. Maybe not scotch. And they tell each other the stories, what's been going on. They get caught up. It's a beautiful reunion described in the Torah. But our rabbis focus much more on something else. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed low and kissed him. Now, first, it's interesting that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, the man who is the chief prophet of God, the man who just led millions of people from slavery into freedom, now standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, Moses doesn't say, I'll wait here for my father-in-law to come to me. Moses goes out to meet his father-in-law. The great Moshe Rabbeinu goes out to meet his father-in-law. And then based on the Hebrew, it's unclear what happens next. It says, he bowed low and kissed him. Who bowed and who kissed whom? Our rabbis solved the mystery for us in saying that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, this humble servant of God, Moses, this great leader of the Jewish people, bowed before his father-in-law. And Moses kissed Jethro. And from this, our rabbis come to teach that a person, a man or a woman, should treat his in-laws just as he treats his own parents. Now remember, this is coming from a perspective that honor your mother and father is the fifth commandment. We're presuming you're treating your own parents well. And so our rabbis come to teach that a man or a woman should honor his or her in-laws just as he would honor his or her own parents. Do you agree? Do you think that a person should honor his in-laws just as he honors his own parents? Our rabbis bring further proof texts, and they actually turn to later in the Hebrew Bible. They turn to the book of 1 Samuel. And there, David is actually running from his father-in-law, King Saul. David is hiding from his father-in-law, King Saul, because King Saul is out to kill David. King Saul feels threatened by David and thinks that David is after Saul's throne. And so sure enough, David is hiding in a cave when King Saul comes into that very cave that David is hiding in. And it's dark and he can't see much, so King Saul actually turns to the wall. I won't tell you what he was doing there up against that wall. You can read the Bible for yourself. David sneaks up behind Saul and he cuts off a piece of his garment. Saul doesn't even notice. Later on, when David and Saul finally reunite and Saul is ready to kill his son-in-law David, David pulls out the piece of garment and says, "Dad, look at your clothes. I could have killed you, but I chose not to." And our rabbis look at the language that David used. David turned to Saul and said, "Dad, Father, I could have killed you, but I chose not to." And our rabbis come to say that if David could even treat King Saul, who was trying to kill him, his father-in-law, with that much respect by calling him Dad, then truly each of us should treat our in-laws as if they're parents of our own. Now, our rabbis later on, the Kabbalists of Tzfat, actually added to a whole other teaching of that. And they say, of course, we should treat our in-laws as if they're our own parents. Because after all, we know that when a husband and wife come together, it's beshert. What is a marriage? A marriage is actually bringing together two half souls. That when God creates a whole human soul, God actually divides that soul into half. And he places half a soul into a man and half a soul into a woman. And when we find our beshert, the other half of our soul, we come together in marriage. And so sure enough, the parents of our spouse are indeed like our own parents because they parented the other half of the soul. Other rabbis add, no, you shouldn't treat your in-laws the way you treat your parents. In fact, you should treat your in-laws even better than the way you treat your parents, because your in-laws are responsible for raising your husband or wife. And so in honoring your husband or wife, in the mitzvah, in the commandment to honor your partner, your spouse, you should actually treat your in-laws with even more respect, because they're the ones who raised the love of your life, your beshert. So there we have some wisdom from our tradition on how we are supposed to treat our in-laws, and I know based on the head nods around the room, clearly everyone already treats their in-laws in this way. But how ought parents-in-law to treat their children? Now we have here, if you'll turn with me, I am on page 434 in our Eitz Chaim Chumashim. Verse 13, it says, the next day after Yitro reunited Moses and Zipporah, they all came back together. It says, the next day Moses sat as magistrate among the people, while the people stood about Moses from morning until evening. But when Moses' father-in-law saw how much he had to do for the people, he said, what is this thing that you're doing to the people? Why do you act alone? Why all the people stand about you from morning until evening? Jethro says to Moses, you're killing yourself. and you're slowing down the needs of the Jewish people. You can't take it all upon yourself. You have to delegate responsibility. You have to share the authority for leading the Jewish people. And in that moment, Moses learns from his father-in-law. And with his father-in-law, they devise a system of judges. You have the highest court, which is Moses. Then you have lower courts, and you have lower courts, and you have lower courts. And I'll just take this moment as we focus on the development here of the court system in the Jewish people. And we know how it's come to influence our own American system of law. To wish a mazel tov to Judge Jonathan Tuckle, who is joining us now in Shul for the first time as Judge Tuckle. And Chazan Propus and I had the honor of participating in his installation service this week as a judge of the Michigan Court of Appeals. Mazel tov, we're honored by your presence and just so happy for you and your whole family. So here Jethro says to Moses, you can't do it all by yourself. Set up this system of shared responsibility. The thing you are doing is not right, Jethro says to Moses. Can you imagine a parent-in-law saying to a child-in-law, the thing that you are doing is not right? Such a thing has never happened before in the history of the Jewish people. But sure enough, we jump to verse 44. It says, Moses heeded his father-in-law and did just as he said. There's very little by way of Jewish law about how a parent-in-law ought to treat the child-in-law. In fact, we come from a system where the parents get all the respect, and the children have to honor their parents or their in-laws fully and entirely. But we live in 21st century America. And so as I was preparing for the sermon, I looked up advice on how parents-in-law should treat their children-in-law. And surely I could tell you, just act as my in-laws act, because they're watching, I'm sure, on the live streaming right now. Hello, Shabbat Shalom, who treat us always with love and respect. I'm sure that you could all act as my parents do toward Rebecca, just pure, unadulterated love and perfection. And I'm sure she would agree with me 100%. But as I came across the advice from parents-in-law to children-in-law, one of the things that the wisdom of the internet comes to recommend is that different does not always mean worse. Moms and dads, remember, as you have a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law, remember, different does not always mean worse. And the other good piece of advice that I saw online was, what is the best wisdom to give to someone becoming a father-in-law or a mother-in-law? It would be similar to what Linda said at the beginning of the sermon, with one addendum. The best advice to give to someone becoming a mother-in-law or a father-in-law: keep your mouth shut and your checkbook open. On this Shabbat of Parashat Yitro, may we be ever emboldened to treat our in-laws with even more respect than whatever we did before. And may we remember that for the sake of the future of the Jewish people and the strength of marriage and the family system, may we learn to treat our children-in-law with respect as well. Shabbat Shalom.